The air was thick with tension as the world watched a live broadcast from Tel Aviv. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood before a wall of Israeli flags, his voice sharp and cold as steel. "This is no longer a skirmish," he declared. "This is war. Gaza will kneel, or Gaza will burn." The words echoed across capitals, through newsrooms, and into war rooms. But it was in Ouagadougou, thousands of miles from Gaza, that a different kind of response was forming. One not of submission, but defiance. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, had just concluded a security meeting when his aide whispered the news in his ear. His jaw clenched. He stood from his chair, eyes burning with something deeper than fury, conviction. "Call the cabinet back," he said. "And get the cameras ready." Within the hour, a special address was broadcast. Traoré didn't speak from behind a podium. He stood beneath the open sky, flanked by young soldiers in worn boots, most younger than the war itself. Dust swirled around them like a silent witness to history. "If Netanyahu wants war," Traoré began, "then he will see what war looks like when justice is behind the gun." The world hadn't seen such clarity since Mandela. His words weren't just defiance, they were a declaration. Not of power, but of purpose. "I will not let the screams of Palestinian children be swallowed by silence. If leaders won't stop the bombs, then we will stop the leaders." The broadcast ended in stunned silence. Western analysts called it reckless. African youth called it hope. And Netanyahu? He watched from a bunker, eyes narrowed, not with fear, but something worse, doubt. Traoré had just shifted the war from borders to beliefs. And belief, history had shown, was harder to kill than any army. In the shadow of Netanyahu's war drums, silence had settled over much of the diplomatic world. Western leaders issued soft condemnations, calls for restraint, and meaningless gestures. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't wait for consensus. He moved. While the UN held emergency sessions that went nowhere, Traoré summoned Burkina Faso's ambassadors from across Africa and the Middle East. One by one, he listened. Then, he gave orders. "Call Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea. Tell them this isn't just about Gaza. This is about all of us." Within days, a coalition began to form, not with armies, but with voices, oil, gold, and leverage. Africa, long dismissed as a pawn, was starting to act like a player, and the world felt the tremble. But Traoré wasn't only building alliances, he was mobilizing. The military was placed on alert. Not for an invasion, but for a message. "We will not be silent while children are buried in rubble." He visited a refugee camp in Ouagadougou filled with Palestinians who had fled war years ago. One little boy, barefoot and clutching a broken toy, looked up and asked, "Will you stop the bombs?" Traoré knelt. "We'll stop the man behind them." His visit made headlines. But more importantly, it made enemies. In Washington, certain senators began calling him a rogue. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu called for surveillance on West African nations. In Paris, old colonial whispers turned into strategic meetings. But Traoré didn't flinch. The pressure made him louder. "Israel bombs schools," he said in an African Union meeting, "and they call it self-defense. If Gaza fights back, they call it terrorism. But the world is watching now. And this time, the world won't blink." The room erupted, not in applause, but in resolve. Something had shifted. Africa, through Traoré, had found its voice. And that voice wasn't asking, it was warning. The Israeli airstrikes intensified, Gaza's skyline burned orange through the night, and children's cries echoed beneath crumbling concrete. Netanyahu stood before cameras, promising more raids, more pressure, more war. "We will not stop," he declared. "Not until Hamas is dust." And still, Traoré didn't raise a single weapon, not yet. Instead, he raised stakes. From Ouagadougou, he broadcasted a message across every major network that would dare to carry it. His eyes were calm, but there was iron beneath his voice. "You think war ends with bombs?" he asked. "You think it ends with the death of every Palestinian child? No. That's how it begins." The video went viral in hours. Across Johannesburg, Lagos, Tunis, and even in some neighborhoods of Chicago and Marseille, people replayed his words on their phones like scripture. And then came the part that shook global capitals. "We're not sending missiles. We're sending markets into panic. We're sending gold out of your banks. We're sending oil away from your ports. Africa will no longer feed the hand that funds Gaza's destruction." It wasn't a military threat. It was a financial siege. The next day, Burkina Faso halted gold exports to companies affiliated with Israeli backers. Mali and Guinea followed. Then came whispers that Saudi Arabia, still bruised by American arrogance, was entertaining Traoré's calls. Netanyahu raged behind closed doors. "This African child dares dictate terms to me," but behind the fury was fear. For the first time in years, Tel Aviv's allies were splintering. European banks saw a slight shift in reserves. The shekel wobbled. And in African markets, Traoré's popularity soared like wildfire. Meanwhile, back in the refugee camps of Gaza, a battered school wall bore new graffiti, spray-painted in black. "Not alone. Traoré stands." He hadn't fired a bullet. Yet the battlefield was bending around him. And Netanyahu was starting to realize it. While Netanyahu rattled sabers and deployed drones, the resistance was shifting, far from the battlefield, deep into the boardrooms and global councils. What Traoré launched wasn't just retaliation. It was a reshaping of alliances. The African Union convened an emergency session. For the first time, not a whisper of Western presence was allowed. Cameras were shut off. Phones confiscated. And then Traoré stood, not as a president, but as a man speaking for an entire continent that had bled too long for wars it never started. "They call us silent," he began, "but it is only because no one gave us a microphone. Now, we build our own." Around him, leaders leaned in. Kenya, Senegal, Tanzania, even hesitant Egypt, all listening. Then Traoré dropped the gauntlet. "We propose an embargo. No African state shall send uranium, gold, coltan, or oil to any nation actively funding the siege on Gaza. No minerals, no peace." It was thunder in a sealed room. Some gasped. Others nodded. Meanwhile, in Washington, alarms were ringing. Wall Street analysts warned of a ripple effect. If Africa follows through, one anchor said, the West's tech, energy, and defense supply chains could be paralyzed in months. Netanyahu, of course, dismissed it. "They need us more than we need them," he barked. But that confidence was cracking. Within 48 hours, Brazil issued a statement supporting the embargo. Bolivia followed. And then, shockingly, Turkey agreed to join a parallel oil coalition, bypassing American oversight. The world wasn't shifting. It was splitting. And through it all, Traoré didn't blink. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply stood, like a storm waiting at the gates. On the ground in Gaza, children scribbled new drawings. No longer just of bombs and tanks, but of a dark-skinned man in a beret, standing with one hand raised, the other holding a broken chain. Traoré's war wasn't against a people, it was against silence. And silence was losing. As the embargo plan took root, the global media scrambled. CNN aired panels in panic. Fox News raged. European outlets cautiously questioned if Africa had finally learned to play the game not with soldiers, but with scarcity. But while headlines screamed, Traoré moved in silence. At midnight, a jet touched down in Algiers. No press. No parade. Just a convoy of armored vehicles waiting in the desert dark. In one of them sat Algeria's intelligence chief, in another, Mali's transitional defense minister, and in the last, Traoré, calm, unreadable. They drove into the Atlas Mountains, where a covert summit was underway. The mission? Formation of a continental resource pact, the Sahel Accord. One by one, ministers signed. The deal: no more raw exports without sovereignty clauses. No contracts without transparency. And no alliances with nations complicit in Gaza's destruction. But it wasn't just policy. It was personal. Traoré stood before the gathering and unrolled a photo, blown up, grainy. A child in Gaza holding a torn Burkina Faso flag. Found beneath rubble. Sent to him by a doctor from Rafah. "This isn't a foreign war anymore," he said. This is bloodline. This is memory. Suddenly, alliances forged not from treaties, but from trauma, began to form. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's cabinet grew restless. Economic advisors warned of collapsing tech supply routes. Arms manufacturers panicked. U.S. senators phoned Jerusalem, frustrated. Fix this, they said, now. But Netanyahu, wounded in pride, barked back, he's bluffing. He wasn't. Back in West Africa, an old gold mine shuttered for years roared back to life, not for export, but for leverage. Engineers worked around the clock under military guard. The war was evolving. Not with missiles, but minerals. Not with blood, but boldness. And Traoré? He was no longer reacting. He was rewriting the playbook. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, Traoré addressed the nation, not in a studio, but from the iron gates of a sealed western mining facility. Dozens of African flags fluttered behind him, not one of them white and blue. No more digging for others, he declared. Today, Africa digs for its future. The message wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. That same morning, the Israeli ambassador requested an emergency call. It was denied, twice. When the third call came through, Traoré's secretary simply said, Burkina Faso does not answer to war criminals. The ripple was immediate. Stock markets wobbled. American CEOs held closed-door meetings. European diplomats reached out privately, asking if Traoré would consider a recalibration. His answer? Silence. Meanwhile, across the border in Ghana, a surprise broadcast aired, a joint statement from Ghana, Mali, and Niger supporting the Sahel Accord. The message ended with a phrase not heard since the days of Nkrumah. Pan-African defense is not a dream, it's an obligation. Netanyahu, watching from his war room, snapped. This isn't about Gaza anymore, he yelled at his defense chief. It's a global insurrection dressed in righteousness. He wasn't wrong. Traoré's movement had become more than a protest. It was a blueprint. In a secure bunker, U.S. intelligence analyzed satellite data showing rapid troop mobilization, not in Israel, but in Africa. But these weren't soldiers preparing for combat. They were securing ports. They were reinforcing gold transit routes. They were preparing for economic war. In a meeting with his generals, Traoré looked each one in the eye. This is not revenge, he said. It's justice with discipline. They taught us to obey through fear. Now we teach them to respect through power. And as the world kept its eyes on Gaza, the real theater was shifting beneath their feet. To the mines. To the ports. To the continent they once dismissed. Africa wasn't just rising. It was calculating. A convoy of unmarked trucks rumbled through the red clay roads of Burkina Faso, guarded not by foreign contractors, but by local militias, armed, trained, and fiercely loyal to Traoré. Inside those trucks weren't weapons. They carried something far more dangerous: data drives, contracts, and geological maps. The West had underestimated the value of African knowledge. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu stood before his military cabinet. His voice was sharp, his eyes sleepless. He's isolating us, he admitted. Every time we drop bombs, he gains allies. An aide handed him a file labeled, Operation Eclipse. It detailed Traoré's recent meetings, not just with African leaders, but also with South American and Southeast Asian diplomats. Quiet alliances. Quiet trade deals. Quiet revolutions. And yet, Traoré didn't speak of retaliation. He spoke of structure. Of removing every colonial tendon still buried in Africa's muscles. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Traoré walked in late. The room fell silent. He wore no tie. No French, no English, he spoke in his native Moor. Their wars are not ours. Their hatred is not our inheritance. If Gaza burns, and we remain quiet, we are complicit in the fire. The applause wasn't just polite, it was thunderous. Netanyahu watched the speech later that night. Alone. He saw something that terrified him, not anger, not militancy, but control. Traoré wasn't a radical. He was a strategist. Back in the Sahel, schools reopened. Local currencies circulated. Chinese engineers quietly arrived, not for mining, but for energy infrastructure, under strict African ownership terms. It wasn't resistance anymore. It was a parallel system. One that didn't ask permission. One that didn't flinch under threats. Netanyahu could launch missiles. But Traoré was launching institutions. And the longer the world treated him like a rebel, the more his movement became a government, by example, not by approval. In a dimly lit intelligence bunker in Tel Aviv, a red alert flashed across multiple screens. One of Netanyahu's advisors leaned forward, eyes widening. "Sir, they've rerouted global mineral trade away from our allies, again." Netanyahu didn't respond at first. He stared at a map showing new supply chains forming across the global south, Burkina Faso to Indonesia, Mali to Venezuela, Ghana to Brazil. None touched NATO soil. Meanwhile, in the capital of Burkina Faso, Traoré stood before a crowd of university students. He didn't read from a teleprompter. He paced slowly, eyes locked on their faces. "War," he said, "is not just bombs. It is economic theft. It is cultural erasure. It is the idea that we must ask permission to be free." He held up a folder, declassified agreements signed between Western companies and past African regimes. "This is war," he said. "And we are winning ours." That clip went viral. Across TikTok in Senegal, across Telegram channels in Gaza, across news stations in Cuba. His voice cut through languages. His defiance became a signal. Back in Israel, Netanyahu slammed his fist on the desk. "Why do they keep listening to him?" he shouted. An aide answered quietly, "Because he doesn't speak like a politician. He speaks like history." Outside the Knesset, protests had begun, small, but loud. Placards read, "Stop the bombing." Others said, "Africa won't kneel." The world was shifting, and Netanyahu could feel it in his bones. The war he started in Gaza was bleeding into something much larger. Something he couldn't bomb into silence. And in Ouagadougou, Traoré received a call, from a Middle Eastern diplomat known to be close to Tehran. "You may have more allies than you think," the voice said. Traoré didn't smile. He simply nodded and replied, "Good. Then let's build something the empire can't touch." It was midnight in Jerusalem, but the war room never slept. Netanyahu stood before his military chiefs, voice rasping with frustration. "Traoré is weaponizing diplomacy. He's turning every neutral country against us." One of the generals replied, "It's not just diplomacy, sir. He's arming alliances." They played intercepted footage, African-built drones patrolling gold mines, satellite signals rerouted through Chinese networks, and a new military base rumored to be constructed in the Sahel with assistance from Iran and Turkey. Netanyahu waved his hand dismissively. "So we isolate him. Sanctions. Pressure the UN, spread fear." But fear was no longer a currency that held value. Across the Atlantic, in Washington, a reporter asked the White House press secretary, "Is the president considering direct intervention in West Africa?" The answer was vague, but it didn't matter. The internet filled the gaps with speculation, and then, with something more dangerous, solidarity. In Nairobi, artists painted murals of Traoré standing over broken chains. In Rio, a protest banner read, "Not their gold. Not their war." And in Gaza, where Israeli airstrikes lit the night sky, an unexpected message arrived through encrypted networks, Traoré's recorded speech, translated and shared by volunteers. "You are not forgotten," he had said. "We stand with you, not with your occupiers. Africa remembers what colonization looks like, and we fight it wherever it hides." The voice echoed in darkened shelters. Mothers wept silently. Children listened. Fighters stiffened their backs. That night, IDF operations in Gaza faced their first large-scale cyber disruption. Drones lost control. Maps flickered. Communications failed. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré was silent. His phone buzzed, another message from an unknown number, Phase 1 complete. He looked up at the sky, stars veiled behind Harmattan clouds. This isn't revenge, he whispered. It's restoration. The war was no longer his alone. The world had chosen its side. The United Nations building buzzed with emergency meetings. Delegates rushed between chambers, clutching dossiers marked confidential. But one name echoed louder than all others, Traoré. Israel had deployed new squadrons over Gaza. Civilian casualties surged. Western media spun headlines, but raw footage told the truth. Traoré, however, wasn't reacting with outrage. He was calculating. Inside a command room buried beneath Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before a wall of screens. Footage from Gaza, reports from African partners, and global economic charts blinked in unison. Initiate the embargo, he said. Within hours, gold exports from 6 West African nations were halted. Ports closed. Trade stalled. The ripple reached London, Wall Street, Tel Aviv. Scott Bessent, watching the markets from Manhattan, slammed his hand on the table. This kid is pulling the rug out from the entire system. Back in Israel, Netanyahu watched Africa cut itself from global financial arteries. He's bluffing, he hissed. But then came the oil. Algeria and Nigeria, under pressure from Traoré's diplomatic surge, began reconsidering supply agreements. Prices spiked. European leaders panicked. At the UN, a new vote was called, this time not for condemnation of Gaza's resistance, but for a ceasefire. And for the first time, African votes swayed the chamber. Traoré didn't even attend the vote. He was already on the ground, walking rubble-lined streets in northern Burkina Faso, greeting displaced families, rebuilding with his own hands. A child ran up to him, barefoot and dust-covered. Did we win? Traoré knelt. We're not done yet. But they know now, we're not theirs to rule. As the world watched, a new map was being drawn, not by empires, but by those who had once been buried beneath them. And somewhere in the desert wind, a whisper carried Traoré's words to every broken wall and shattered city. Africa will not kneel. Not again. Not ever.